right, we're talking, of course, about your letter to the Federal Trade Commission regarding Facebook, and the first question that comes to mind is how many companies are doing data mining and trying to get backgrounds on potential consumers, and how what Facebook allegedly did, how that set them apart to warrant a letter to the Federal Trade Commission by a senator.
Well, Tom, I came from the technology business, and I understand that technology companies use information to try to improve products, to kind of test new areas. So I'm not saying Facebook necessarily crossed a line, because I'm not sure we even know where that line exists at this point. It was strange to me that they acknowledged that potentially withholding information that people were literally putting on their page, that raises some questions. I think that I'm not saying even that this should require some major governmental intervention. It may require the industry itself to sort these issues out. It may require being clearer when a customer signs up, that maybe there ought to be an opt-in or an opt-out about how much of your information you want to have used for experimentation and new product development. This is a brave new space, and as somebody who was in the technology business before I went in politics, I don't want government to overly intervene, but I think this idea of what expectation of privacy we all have, and frankly, probably younger folks have got a different view than maybe what I've got, ought to at least start a conversation.
Now, Adam Kramer, Facebook data scientist, he was quoted recently in the Wall Street Journal talking about what Facebook did, and said, at the end of the day, the actual impact on people in the experiment was minimal. And he wrote that on his Facebook page, as a matter of fact. But that apparently, that still is not going to be good enough for your curiosity.
Well, Tom, I guess I'd say this. I'd love to see some social scientists who might not have a connection with the company come to that same conclusion. I do wonder if someone had a major event in their life that they looking to share with friends or get support from friends, and somehow that information wasn't posted on your page because Facebook was experimenting with your moods. I think most folks would probably want to know that they were perhaps being subject to that kind of experimentation, and they could at least opt in or opt out. This is, I think we've seen new products develop as I know my kids use some of the new sites where they can send a photo, but that photo disappears after a few seconds, so it can't be sent on down the line.
Snapchat,
yeah. They are active users of that. But the question becomes, I came from the technology business. I don't want undue government regulation. But I also think that if we don't start these conversations, this could actually blow back on technology and companies like Facebook in a way that could have a real downside. So I hope that they will take this in the spirit that it's offered, that they ought to engage with whether the FTC, other industries, social scientists, and perhaps create a little clearer expectation of what a customer is signing up for and not signing up for.
Well, that's interesting, because part of that conversation could include how much do you put out there on your own. A lot of times in this newsroom, we marvel at what people put out there for all of us to see on social media, and we don't even know if people realize that lives forever in many cases.
Tom, I tell you, there's a lot of folks in the political business that I think probably posted years ago that it would come back and haunt them. So, this is a brave new world. And there is clearly positive implications of being able to kind of use big data in a way that advances technology and advances services that consumers want. And I think consumers ought to have those choices. I do think there ought to be at least a little more acknowledgement of how that information is going to be used. And frankly, it would probably be better if that was set up by industry rather than some over-regulatory governmental burden. But again, this is what I want to do here is start a conversation. We want to take this one incident and say, not with a blame towards Facebook, but to say, hey, these are questions that ought to be asked. There's going to be other companies that are going to be going down this line, trying to use and manipulate data as well. Let's try to have a little clearer idea of how that's being used and what you're signing up for. And I think at the end of the day, we'll reach some kind of balance that right now is still pretty new for most of us.
Well, suppose the balance, in your view, is not reached. Would you then favor any kind of government regulation into these kinds of data minings?
there's already FTC looking at some levels of data mining.
Sure.
And some of this, I always like the idea of, do you want to know which pizza store is offering a special when you happen to be in that neighborhood? Yes, you want to know that. On the other hand, if you go to a store and you buy X different number of products, do you want to be profiled? And that profiling based on your product purchases could be a little strange too. So I think I'm not sure where this all leads. I am reluctant to start with the premise that government ought to play an overly intrusive role. But I do think that there ought to be a kind of more thorough conversation than a few-day story in the media about this incident with Facebook. There were concerns in my mind about somebody that wanted to share information that was having that withheld in a way that might not make sense, and I think we're going to start that. We're clearly got your attention, so that's a first step in the right direction.
And there's one more question,
Sure.
if I may just pivot to immigration.
Sure.
I mean, there's been a lot going on developing this week about what's happening at the border, Texas and Arizona. The president is asking for $3.7 billion from Congress to address these issues. We heard the House Speaker say yesterday that doesn't go far enough. Where do you fall on this issue? And I know you've been quoted before as saying we have to do more in these countries like Honduras and other these third world Central American countries that promote the atmosphere of having these people want to leave and then come to the U.S. But what can we do in the meantime?
Well, I think, listen, June 2nd, I sent a letter to both Secretary of Homeland Security and Secretary of State to say, you need to get on top of this problem. And it's only exacerbated. And I do think there's going to have to be a multi-tiered approach. One is going to be how you stop the flow of these young people from Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. And they are going not only to America, but they're going to other countries in the region. So part of this is refugee, part of this is a danger issue and a criminal element issue. So there has to be actions in country. There has to be actions at the border in terms of, and you will need more resources to process these young people so there's not that expectation they can stay coming here.
Right.
And that's going to require resources. And it also, in my mind, calls out for the kind of greater need that rather than doing this as kind of a one-off, we ought to have an overall immigration reform. I mean, clearly this is one more example of a system being broken, a result of something that was passed by Congress virtually unanimously under President Bush that now has proven to be a problem, but it needs to be resolved not just on a one-off, but on a more comprehensive basis.
And how would we get to that point, to get to comprehensive reform, even though many in the House have said this is a dead issue for this year?
Well, I don't understand. The Senate bill that got 68 votes that was passed over a year ago put a tremendous amount, more money than even I think the president has called for in terms of additional border security. So if we're talking about border security, that would have been addressed in immigration reform. If you'd had a set process, there wouldn't be potentially people, which were heard, saying trying to get across the line before a new law takes in place. If you had a new law, you'd have that set line, and there wouldn't be people trying to get in before a date. And clearly, from a security, from a budget, from a productivity standpoint, on all of these metrics, the immigration reform seemed to score pretty high. That's why it had broad bipartisan support from business and elsewhere. So I do hope that the House will at least take up part of the president's actions. I think I want to look at the details of what he's requesting. We've got to make sure that we don't allow an expectation that if you travel 3,000 miles from one of these countries that you're going to be able to stay here without some appropriate adjudication process. And this is just one more example that the current system is broken. So let's not do it one-off. Let's actually fix the whole system.